We wanted to get your thoughts on the recent stepping down of Stephen McNeil as Premier of Nova Scotia. And of course, he'll stay on until a permanent leader is chosen. But I wanted to ask you to begin with, were you caught off guard? Were you surprised by the announcement? What was your immediate reaction when you heard the news just a couple of weeks ago?
Well, it was a sense of shock, which I think is what everyone in Nova Scotia had in not seeing it coming. But looking at the reasons that he provided afterwards, having served for 19 years, having the honor of representing the people of Richmond and then Cape Breton-Richmond, he's done it for 17 years. 7 of those was as Premier and even longer as leader of the party. So certainly I can appreciate the fact that he said he was tired. And it was time for him to move on to something else. And we all know that the last 6 months has been extremely challenging all over the world, and certainly here in Nova Scotia on not only what COVID has done, but when one looks at some of the horrific events that took place, the largest mass murder in Canadian history, the loss of service people with the military helicopter crash, one of the snowbird pilots being killed, and the fact that Premier had to stand in front of Nova Scotians on a weekly basis in the face of such tragedy. And I think Nova Scotians really relied upon him for comfort and for guidance in such difficult times. I can't imagine the tremendous personal toll that would have had on him of having to be the face for the province, of reassuring Nova Scotians, making decisions in unprecedented conditions, and then having to deal with these tragedies on top of it. I can only imagine how difficult it was, and certainly appreciate and respect the fact that he made it clear that it was his intention to step down after presenting his 5th balanced budget in the spring. But because of COVID, I think it's just another sign of Stephen McNeil's personality, and that he wasn't prepared to leave province in such a difficult time and instead chose to stay on, not knowing how long this was going to take, and through some very difficult periods.
I'm curious, just to springboard off that, Michel, the Premier has won back-to-back majority governments for the first time since John Buchanan did it back in the 80s, so he's had electoral success. But by the same token, there have been some corners of the province in which he hasn't been well-liked, in which his public demeanor may have turned some people off. Do you get the sense, watching what's happened in the last few months, that Premier McNeil may have been able to rehabilitate his image a little bit with some of those corners where there may have been detractors? Do you feel like the leadership he's provided may have won a few people over that weren't necessarily with him in early 2020?
There's no question of that, Adam. I heard from a number of people who reached out to me to various means of communication. Some said, look, I didn't vote for him, but I now have a much better appreciation of who he is. And that's one of the challenges that you face in elected life, in that many Nova Scotians outside of your own riding make impressions based on what they see in the media, which often is going to be a very short clip, maybe one of the questions in question period, and that can make impressions on people. And I think Nova Scotians, some of them may have had a negative impression of the Premier in that they only saw one side. And I think because of the pandemic and the way the news conferences were structured, it allowed him to speak freely and allowed him to show that side. And I think during COVID especially, what I heard from people is that I think he struck the right balance, and that there were some days where he had to be angry and almost like the father figure of telling Nova Scotians, you have to follow these rules and you have to be responsible. And at the same time, I think he showed that balance of when things were going well, and especially during the tragedies that we faced, of showing that compassionate side and, giving Nova Scotians the moral boost that I think we all needed during the time. So absolutely, I certainly think that he gets to leave with Nova Scotians having seen the side of him that we've all seen, who worked with him so closely, that we knew was there, but that wasn't always being shown through the media. I think the pandemic certainly showed that side of him.
Well, let's wind the clock back a little bit on your first impressions of him. Going back 17 years, he was first elected in Annapolis in 2003. We knew he had some roots here in Richmond County as well during that time. What did you think of him when he first came on deck as an MLA, and then as things started to shift towards him running for the Liberal leadership in 2007?
Well, I think what a lot of people might not realize is that the Premier ran in the general election of 1999 in Annapolis and was unsuccessful. That's when John Hamm defeated the McClellan government and formed a majority government. And so after not having electoral success, he continued to work hard in his riding. And in 2003, he was successful, even though it was a minority conservative government that was elected. He was elected in Annapolis and hasn't looked back since. And you're right, I was elected first in 98, so I was already at that point, in political terms, a veteran, having survived 3 elections. And so I did get to see him grow as a person, grow in his confidence. And by the time he did become leader and we would watch him give speeches and everything else, many times with no notes in front of him, and able to speak. And when he became premier and I would go to Chamber of Commerce events or others, everyone would remark at how confident he spoke, that he spoke from the heart, didn't need notes in front of him, didn't need a teleprompter, and knew how to speak to the crowd that he was in front of. So there's no question that he certainly matured in many ways during his time, from when he was first elected to when he became leader to when he became premier. But there's no question, you would be hard-pressed to have heard a speech from the premier without him mentioning his mother Teresa, without him mentioning Lardwez, Lower Lardwez to be specific, and the roots in Richmond County and his roots in Cape Breton. He was very proud of it. He was certainly very proud of his mom. I think a lot of people know the family story and the tragedy that they faced, and from a very large family. And I think he always maintained those roots. And even when he had some very difficult decisions to make, it was always on the basis that it was the right decision for the province.
I wanted to ask you, and it may not be a fair comparison, but I'll ask you anyway. You worked very briefly in the cabinet of Russell McClellan during that minority situation in the late 90s. It came just after you won your first election as an MLA in Richmond County. How does Russell McClellan compare to Premier McNeil, to Stephen McNeil, in the way that they operated not only the government, but as well the way they operated just working with caucus?
I think it was such a different time. When I look back at going into cabinet in 1998, it was minority government. We had just lost half of our seats in the 98 election. We were tied with the NDP for seats. We each had 19 and the Conservatives had 10. You were living day to day as a government. It was almost impossible to do any long-term planning. It was a matter of how are we going to get a throne speech passed? How are we going to get a budget passed? That was a priority of the day, and that was the focus. It was impossible to do long-term planning. Whereas with Premier McNeil, after the 2013 election, it was a significant majority. We knew that we had 3 to 4 years to be able to do long-term planning and have a vision set for the province. So I think because the circumstances were so different, it's very hard to explain the difference in approach. But just like all human beings, everyone brings a different approach to governance. And Russell McClellan had his own approach, and certainly Stephen McNeil brought his own approach to it as well. What was very clear with Premier McNeil is that we had to stick to our plan. And having been elected for 19 years, I've watched Liberal governments, Conservative governments, NDP government, and we wanted to learn from some of the mistakes that had been made in the past, and the fact that we had to bring fiscal balance to the province, and to do so was going to take some very difficult decisions, and we had to stick to them. And that's one thing he certainly made sure of, is that we did stick to them. And fortunately, the Premier had a loyalty in the caucus and in the cabinet that everyone stuck together. And having watched other governments in the past, Adam, I've seen cracks appear publicly, privately, and governments having to back down because they couldn't sustain the pressure that they were facing. That's one thing that no one will ever suggest from Premier McNeil, is that he backed down in the face of pressure. But at the same time, I think it speaks volumes of his leadership that with the men and women that served with him, remained committed to him right to the very end.
I want to pick up on the concept of loyalty, because he put great stock in your particular position within the Liberal caucus. And then when he started forming his cabinet in 2013, he gave you several important portfolios, economic and rural development, energy at one point, tourism as well. I remember covering an event in my former life as a reporter from the Reporter newspaper, and you and he were speaking, and he made the joke that shortly after being elected, he turned to you and he made you the House leader and said, "Are you sure you got all this?" And you said, "Oh yeah, I've got everything." And he said, "Good, you call me when you need me," and just kind of walked away with a laugh. But I wonder if it is at all possible for you to put into words the kind of relationship you had with him in terms of how much loyalty he put into you as a member of his team.
And I think it's a loyalty that went both ways, and that he knew that I had his back and that I would do whatever I could to support the government and support our agenda. And House Leader is a critical role of getting the legislative agenda of the government passed through the legislature. And I knew how much pressure he was under. As much as my responsibilities were as minister, he was the Premier. He had that much more. And, you know, I took it as a badge of honor when he could look at me and say, "I'm going back to the office. I know you've got everything under control here. And as you said, and as he said, call me when you need me." And that, I thought that was my job, because as Premier, while it's important that he's in the legislature for question period to be accountable and everything else, he's got to govern the province. And you can't really do that sitting on the floor of the legislature. You have to be in your office, getting in briefings, making decisions, and doing planning. And so we had some late night sessions, to say the least, during our time. But my goal was to make sure that he could leave the legislature and know that everything was under control, and that I, along with the cabinet and all of our colleagues, were going to remain committed to getting our legislative agenda through.
I want to speak to you a little bit about what you see going forward for the party. And you knew that I was going to ask this question at some point, so I'm going to ask it now. Have you given any consideration to running for the Liberal leadership now that McNeil has stepped down?
Well, look, I think it was a shock to everyone. So nobody was ever thinking of this. We were all under the belief that the Premier was going to seek a third term. I firmly believe he would have won another majority government, and I think most people would agree. He's walking out with the party at historic numbers. And in fact, Adam, right from 2013, the polling numbers for the Premier and Liberal Party are unprecedented, in that no government in Nova Scotia has ever seen that type of sustained popularity during their mandate. In fact, most governments, within 3 months after election, their poll numbers started to go down and would stay down. But the Premier continued to do that. And I think it's because of his style of governing attracted a lot of people, much more than just traditional Liberals. And that I know a lot of people who have historically supported the Progressive Conservative Party who said, "We voted for Premier McNeil. We like what he's doing." I had one colleague tell me when he was asked to give money and help out in the 2017 campaign, he said, "Why would I want to defeat a Premier who's governing the way that I'd want to see the province governed?" And I think that's why he's had the electoral successes, because he's attracted much more than just Liberal voters. He's attracted voters from both the Progressive Conservatives and from the NDP, which has allowed him to, as you mentioned, win back-to-back majorities, which hadn't been done since the 1980s. So I think it bodes well for the party going forward. I've been approached by a number of people asking me to consider it, which is always very humbling. And sometimes you hear from people that just you never expected to hear from. But I think it's still early days. My focus, when asked, has been on the Premier's legacy, what he was able to do for our province during his time, and I think history will reflect on his tenure very positively. In that, unlike almost all other Canadian provinces, he was able to bring in 4 balanced budget. The one brought in the spring this year would have been the 5th. Unfortunately, a pandemic is going to have a significant impact on that. But he was able to do that while at the same time, one of the first things that he did was call for a full inquiry in the Home for Colored Children, which led to a public apology. And I have to tell you, I know for the Premier personally, that was one of the more touching moments for him, was to be able to deliver that apology and to send a message to the African Nova Scotian community that what was done to them was not right, and it needed to be recognized, and I know that was very important for him. But when you also look at the investments that were made in education, the new pre-primary program, which will addresses some of the concerns we heard from teachers that kids were just not ready socially or in their development when they were arriving in school for grade primary. Now they'll have a full year prior to that to be able to prepare, and significant cost savings for parents in childcare costs as well. I think he'll be remembered for that, and remembered for making the tough decisions that needed to be made for our province, and they weren't the easiest ones. But when wages and labor are 60% of your budget, you need to keep that under control, or you have no hopes of being able to balance the budget. And as the Premier said, none of us took any pleasure in having to make those tough decisions. And I think human nature is such that no one likes to say no to people. We like to be able to solve their problems and be able to make sure that people are happy and pleased with decisions that are made. And so it was an extremely difficult time. But the results speak for themselves, in that the Nova Scotia is rivaled in the economic success that it has had, while at the same time the Premier put an end to the days of the large corporate handouts to companies. And I think he also showed an example in the fact that the members of the Legislative Assembly have not seen any change in their compensation since 2013, 7 years. And he made it clear that if we're going to ask for restraint, we have to show and lead by example. And he showed that. And I know many people think there has been increases, but I can assure you there hasn't. And he wanted to send that clear message, is that if people are going to feel some economic pain, the same has to be said for the elected officials.
You've touched on a number of things that a lot of people will connect to Stephen McNeil, both personally and professionally, and politically as well, too. And I want to wrap this up by asking you if you feel that there were any defining moments for him, something that really stood out for you. I mean, we've talked about his approach to the pandemic. Some will suggest he will be remembered for the 4 words, "Stay the blazes home." And, you've also spoken to some of the tougher decisions that have been made over the course of the government. But is there any 1 or 2 things that really stand out for you where you look and say, yes, that was Stephen McNeil in a nutshell?
Well, look, and I think the way we've seen him perform with Dr. Strang during COVID, there's no question that everything he's done before that will be remembered, but his defining moment was the leadership that he showed during a pandemic. Adam, we were all scared. Many are still scared. This is an unprecedented incident in the history of our province, in the history of the world. And it's not one of those where you can take out a playbook and say, okay, let's see how they handled this the last time, and we'll make our decisions around that. Decisions are having to be made on the fly, having to be made on a day-to-day, hourly basis, and it's extremely difficult. But when you look at where Nova Scotia is and where Atlantic Canada is compared to the rest of the world, we're the envy. I have friends who live in the States and other provinces saying, how can we get to Nova Scotia? Because we feel we'd be safer in Nova Scotia than where we're at. That speaks volumes, and it took some very tough decisions, some that many people were questioning. We are getting ready to have schools reopen. We all understand, and as a parent, we're all a bit scared of how it's all going to work. But I think a lot of people take comfort in the fact that everything the Premier has done throughout this has been well thought out. It's been based on the science provided by Dr. Strang and other healthcare professionals, and it's been in the best interest of Nova Scotians. And God willing, we're going to be able to maintain control over this pandemic going forward, that we are going to have a successful reopening of schools and a safe environment for teachers, students, and all the staff and parents, and that we're going to continue on this path. But I think there's no question that when people will look back, they will look to what they saw from Premier McNeil during this crisis, because the fact that people could watch an entire news conference on national news rather than a 10-second clip on the 6 o'clock news, they got to see him speak freely. And he wasn't given, unlike question period where you're given 45 seconds to give an answer, he could speak several minutes, and he could show that human side to him. People got to see some humor, but they also got to see the father figure of chastising Nova Scotians when they had to be chastised, and telling them, we're in this together and you all have to be part of the solution. So I have no doubt that when Nova Scotians will look back, that will be where they will say, we saw the real Stephen McNeil. And I think those who've seen that side will say, finally, everyone else got to see what we knew all along. And for those who never saw it, it will be, we had no idea that that is who Stephen McNeil was. And it's only during that period that we got to see the human side, the funny side, the compassionate side, the caring side that we knew all along was always there, and I think is reflective in the way that he governed our province.
And that's a good place to wrap this all up. Michel Samson, we thank you for giving us some time and some thoughts here today. Thanks so much for joining us on Telile 24/7.
Well, thanks so much, Adam. And I can tell you I've done, I think, 1 or 2 interviews since the last provincial election. So my respect for you and for your reporting and your fairness in Richmond and the Strait Area is the reason why I agreed to do this, for the personal friendship that you and I have developed, but certainly the respect that I have for the work that you do and for this new venture. So not many other media outlets have managed to convince me to do interviews, but I was happy to be able to have this time to chat with you.
Well, we're happy to have you here and look forward to being able to catch up with you again sometime down the road.
All the best, Adam.
All right, you too. Michel Samson is a lawyer now practicing at the Halifax firm of Cox and Palmer. He is also a former MLA for Richmond and Cape Breton Richmond and served several portfolios in the Stephen McNeil government.